Muckle, Chapter 8, Part 3, Homogeneity versus Heterogeneity. Homogeneous means people are more alike, or at least they share a lot of the same characteristics. So lots of shared identity markers, close-knit farming communities that speak the same language, have the same religion. Think of the Amish. Most people farm in the community. Most people speak their same variety of German in the community. They wear some of the same clothes. They belong to the same churches. Um, Consider that, compare that to heterogeneous, where maybe you have a city with people from multiple different religions, multiple different ways of life. They have different kinds of jobs. Um, they have few shared identity markers. Um, Basically, what they share the most is um, they all live in the same geographic location. Americans generally, yeah, I mean, we all live within the boundaries of the United States, except for those who live abroad. Um, and all we share is a passport or an experience at the DMV. But even the BMV or the DM, the different states have different driver's licenses. So there's a lot we don't share. We share the experience of paying taxes. All Americans have to pay taxes around the world. Everyone does. No other country does this. The United States tracks you down wherever you live and forces you to file a tax return and pay Uncle Sam. Um, so we're all the same that way. Diasporas, some groups are stretched across the world and ties between them are aided by communication technologies. Um, Sometimes, before we had modern communication technologies, those groups just lived remote as they were. And it was only after they came into contact with each other that they found they all spoke the same language or followed the same religion. Um, and sometimes it wasn't the same language or religion. They just sort of it was close enough, and so they started identifying as such. So we have emigrants with an E that leave the country, and then immigrants with an I that come into the country. So we could think about um, when we have people in India who are leaving India, those are emigrants, E. And we have people in the United States when they are Indians coming to America to live here, then these are immigrants with an I. Emigrants leave their homes because of push factors that encourage or force them to leave their homes. Sometimes we talk about forced immigration, people who are forced, whether because they've been enslaved or because they are refugees and were kicked out of their country, or were starving to death and had to leave to survive. Um, as forced immigration, and then there's voluntary immigration, people who are exceptionally um, uh, entrepreneurial, very, very brave, and who love a challenge. And they get up and they say, I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm leaving. I'm going to go to a new place and make a new life there. And that would be voluntary migration. Immigrants, we're looking at, so push factors involve maybe a lack of economic opportunity or a civil war in the case of forced migration. Um, Immigrants, these are pull factors that encourage or force people to come to a new country. Things that encourage immigration, usually it's a shortage of labor. If there's a labor shortage, that drives up salaries and wages, and it is very, very enticing for maybe a top shelf Indian biochemist who's sitting there in India, commanding a huge salary of $15,000 a year, realizing that if he lived in America, he could make 10 times that or more. And so he applies for a visa. Um, so these are pull factors. Also, just sort of immigrant-friendly um, laws, immigrant-friendly societies. If you look around, ask people, what cities in Southwest Ohio are really welcoming to outsiders and say, hey, thanks for coming. We like you here. And what cities are more sort of, who are you? Where are you from? We don't like you. And you can tell, people know when they're being welcomed, and move in and refuse to move in if they know they're not welcome. Learning culture and culturation, the process through which culture is transmitted to new generations. So we know that culture is learned, and the only way you can learn it usually is through being raised within that culture. If you are not raised speaking Southwest Ohio English, you'll speak English with an accent, either from where you were raised, another variety of English like Scottish or Nigerian, or a completely different language like Urdu or Greek or something like that. So when you learn your language, then you get it. You get your culture. Language and culture very closely. We'll come to language next week, though. Race and ethnicity. So race, we've said this before, but we're going to hit it a little harder now. Biological race is a pseudoscientific myth created to justify slavery, conquest, and global domination. So race as a biological fact does not exist. Science in general favors reduction and determination. So if we're looking at, remember when we talked about science, science reduces complex phenomena into simpler phenomena. We're always trying to figure out what is underlying the logic of this scientific fact. And determination talks about causation. Simpler rules drive the direction and intensity of changes. So if you remember when we talked about, did we talk about gravity? Yeah, we talked about gravity. When you drop the pen, boom, it falls to the floor. Why does it fall to the floor? That's the first prime mover in physics, which is gravity. That means one material object attracts another material object, and the pen falls toward the earth the same way the moon falls toward the earth. The moon is falling toward the earth continually. The only reason it doesn't hit the earth is because it's flying through space fast enough that by the time it would hit the earth, it's already past the horizon and whipped around it. And that's called orbit. And we're continually falling toward the sun and on the earth and all the rest. So this is just one of the simple rules that mean our feet stay planted and our air stays close to our lungs and then gets forced into it. This is determination, causal relationships here. The problem is with human beings is that if we try to get scientific, we very soon realize that it's far more complex than just the attraction of one object to another. And so we find out that if race is biological, this is the argument of eugenics. If race is biological, and this was in the 19th century, up until the 1970s actually, although it was roundly rejected in anthropology by the 1920s, it hung around in public policy throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And even the 90s, they were still doing this. Basically, if race is biological, then maybe poverty, criminality, and ignorance are also biological. If we can prevent poor, criminal, or uneducated women from having children, then we can prevent poverty, crime, and ignorance. So the solution of this was basically mass sterilization for every girl who commits a crime, every girl who fails to learn how to read, every girl who is raised in a very poor household. Boom! You just lost your opportunity to ever have children your whole life. And this was done. This was done really, really heavily in the 20s and 30s. But there are Native American women, especially the weakest in society, get hit the hardest with these laws because they don't have any sort of economic or social power from which to resist the force of the state. And so there were women sterilized in the 90s, First Nations women in Canada as well as Native American women in the United States, sterilized because they were non-literate, they had not been to school and couldn't read and write, or they had broken the law or something like that. So it's a bad thing. We really don't want to get too scientific when it comes to human beings. We want to be really, really careful about reduction and determination. So race is not biological. Race is not scientific. Race is a cultural category that reflects group interpretations of physical appearance. And here we're talking about the basic accepted races of humanity, right? Black and white and Asian and Native American. Red and yellow, black and white was the old Bible song. So these are not biological. There's no biological basis for these categories. There's no way you can take two Africans and say that they are less different from one another than they are to two Europeans. There's usually greater difference between groups than there is between one group and another group, between members of the same group. Um, Race, social understandings of physical, in terms of genetics. If we want to talk about genetics, there are, I think we said this in class, there are something like 4 or 5 races. One group of genes is very similar to each other, and they're all in Southern Africa. Uh, multiple groups in Southern Africa, and then there's another gene group for the rest of Africa, and then there's a third group of genes that are very similar all over the entire rest of the world. And that makes sense because human beings originate in Southern Africa. The very oldest genetic um, material comes out of Southern Africa, or really all over Africa. Race. So race, social understandings of physical appearance, is much more permanent in a person's lifespan and also much more visible than ethnicity. So this is why race appears. If we think of physical appearance changes sometimes it doesn't. I'm much bolder and more gray than I was when I was younger, but other than that, I look very much like a white guy. Prejudice, preconceived notion of how someone will behave based on their appearance, for racial prejudice. And so there's many different kinds of prejudice. But if you keep your mouth shut and you walk around Germany and you look like me, you're not going to get any sort of bad stuff coming at you because you're American, just because you don't look American, right? You look German. I look German at least. And as long as I keep my mouth shut and don't speak any English to the people, they might mistake me for German. But race is immediately visible. So racial prejudice is much more powerful than other kinds of prejudice. Gender as well, but or disability. There you have it. So discrimination, racial discrimination, is preferential treatment on the basis of their appearance. So not only are there notions that have been preconceived about how they're going to behave, but then there's also discrimination. People are treated preferentially or dispreferentially. And goodness, we're down to up to 12 minutes. So we'll pick this up at discrimination in a little bit.